So for color balance, let's go ahead and bring that up. And you can see that the interface is somewhat similar to what we had with selective color. We've got cyan, magenta, yellow, and then kind of manipulating them both ways is red, green, and blue, just like we had with selective color. The obvious difference is we don't have that black slider, so there's no tint and shade kind of controls within here. The other difference is we don't have individual colors. We only have shadows, midtones, and highlights, whereas in selective color we had these blacks, whites, and neutrals. They're not kind of directly corresponding with one another, and I'll show you the most kind of blatant case of that. If we go into shadows, we would expect that if I crank the blue, it's going to operate kind of the way the selective color did. Remember, we went into here, and let's kind of do that to the extreme here. Let's go to blacks and really turn this down. You can see what's happening is we're injecting blue into just the very deep blacks, very deep shadows. Now, if we do that over here with our color balance tool, let's turn that off, and we go into shadows, you can see if I start sliding that, it's a completely different effect. It's basically creating this sort of bluish color cast across shadow areas, not necessarily the blacks, and it's not necessarily injecting that color into there. It's just kind of, you know, blending in a little bit of the tone into the shadow areas. So it's not like a replacement of color, almost like the other one was. And so it's a much more fine-tuned adjustment. And you would never kind of push it this far because you can see we've lost a ton of detail here at this point. We've really kind of butchered our histogram. So if you're going to use that, again, very subtly, plus minus 10 is really the most you want to do when it comes to some of these adjustments within here, because after that it starts to get a little bit iffy in terms of the quality of the image. We can, of course, do that on any of these colors. We can inject a little bit of red, a little bit of magenta, a little bit of blue, whatever it might be. And as you can see, even just going a little bit there, we're starting to kind of affect the overall image quality. So typically, I make very minor adjustments here, you know, within plus minus 5 on any of these. And generally speaking, it's more for finishing. And where I do like it is in the highlights, where selective color targets just very bright highlights. This is, again, a little more subtle. It, you know, targets a broader range within the highlights. So if we go in here and, for example, we want to just give it a little bit of a cyan kick within the highlights, maybe add a little bit of green in there, and maybe warm them up a tiny bit. That looks pretty nice. I think it's a more effective tool in the highlights than it is in the shadows, and it's also pretty good in the neutrals, or I should say midtones in this case. Neutrals in selective color, midtones here. In that, you know, it's good for removing those color casts as well. So if we want to just kind of, you know, make minor adjustments to the overall coloring of the image, then again, this is kind of a nice place to do it. That, I think, gives you a pretty good idea of what you can do with the various adjustment layers and kind of where they're best. Again, with selective color, I do tend to like it more in the blacks than I do the color balance in the shadows. And with the color balance, I tend to like it more in the highlights than I do like the whites within selective color. And of course, if we're targeting individual colors, we're going to use selective color. It's really more about knowing which tool to use and when. And that's kind of where I want to finish off this segment, which is talking about sort of an overall strategy for color grading. And you're going to see that, of course, when we look at the next lesson, lesson 5 and 6 and 7, and where we're actually going to do sort of a real-life color grade on an image that I've prepared. So the steps that I generally take are, I, of course, start with things like healing, dodging, and burning. Those are the first things I do. And then I do color corrections. So if there's anything that's been left over after the dodging and burning is done, if there's, you know, areas that are desaturated or the hue doesn't quite match up, we're going to fix those. We're going to do that using some of the tools we actually talked about here, and I did talk about in the dodging and burning tutorial. So if you haven't seen that, definitely take a look at that tutorial. And once we've got a clean image to work off of, everything else is done, that's when I get into the grading. And so the grading is very much a finishing sort of thing for me. Some people like to do it beforehand. I don't really see the point. Because at the end of the day, you're still going to do the same dodging and burning, same healing. You still have to fix the colors, so why not just get the image to a good place and then wrap things up with color grading? It's entirely up to you. The one thing I caution you about is if you do the grading first, make sure that you turn off your grading before you dive into the dodge and burn. So with dodging and burning, you'll probably remember we had this sort of helper layer that helped us to visualize the issues. Make sure you turn off all of your grading layers before you actually work on the dodging and burning, because having all those extra layers actually slows down the processing within Photoshop, so your response rate will be much lower. So every little stroke you make within those dodge and burn layers, they'll take longer to show up, and so there'll be a lot of lag there. Make sure you just turn off the grading if you end up doing it beforehand. In a nutshell, the way I do it is once I've got my image kind of set in terms of the dodging and burning, the image is clean, everything is nicely balanced, and we get into the grading part. Again, I start off with the broad adjustments and then I fine tune as I go. So the foundation of that being the luminosity, make sure that we adjust the luminosity, which we did here with this black and white adjustment layer and a curves adjustment. But we can, of course, do that with just curves or just black and white or, whatever tool you kind of want to get the overall mood and feel of the image. So are we going to go more high key? Or are we going to go very low key and moody? And once I have that set, then I'll use something like a gradient map or a solid color layer or maybe a selective color layer within the blacks, color balance within the highlights. Those are our quick tools for adjustment, maybe, curves within the individual channels, maybe even channel mixer if I'm feeling adventurous. So those are those kind of big change type of adjustments. We're going to try those. And again, it all depends on if I want a drastic change or not. Generally speaking, with something like a commercial beauty shot, you're probably not going to make a huge change to the image. You're not going to create these like crazy color casts and, inject blues into the shadows or cyans into the shadows. You probably want something that is very rooted in reality, very natural looking, very bright. So you're going to forego that whole step of, these drastic changes. And we're going to go to the next step, which is these sort of fine tuning tools, refining tools like selective color and color balance. So selective color maybe in the yellows and the reds to adjust the skin tones, maybe pull off some of the color casts. So let's say we want our whites very neutralized and right now they've got a cast to them. So we may use, for example, color balance within the highlights to offset that or selective color in the whites to offset that. And then once all that's done, then I usually finish off with a hue saturation adjustment. So either I may adjust the saturation and just the overall saturation of the image itself, or I may go into the yellows and the reds and just adjust the saturation of the skin tones. Perhaps it needs to be more saturated or less saturated, whatever it may be. So again, it's just starting broad, start with luminosity, broad adjustments, and then fine-tune adjustments to finish things off. And you're going to see that within the next few lessons where we look at sort of real retouches of a few images that we have here. So we'll see you in the next lesson.